I never thought the person who would try to take everything from me would be my own daughter. I was 68 years old. I had my vegetable garden in the backyard, my Tuesday morning water aerobics class at the YMCA, and my volunteer shifts at the county food pantry every other Saturday. I had a routine. I had a life. I had a home I'd lived in for 31 years, the same house where I raised her, where she learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I kept the porch light on every single night until she came home safe. My name is Adele, and this is the story of how my daughter tried to take that house, and how I made sure she couldn't. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 42, lives about 20 minutes away with her husband, Clive. I want to be fair to her, so I'll say this. She wasn't always like this. There was a version of my daughter who called me every Sunday, who brought me soup when I had my hip replacement 6 years ago, who cried at my kitchen table when her first marriage fell apart and I stayed up with her until 2 in the morning. That woman I knew. That woman I loved completely. But Clive changed things. Or maybe he just brought out something that was already there. I don't know. I've stopped trying to figure that out. They got married 4 years ago. The first year was fine. The second year, I started noticing little comments. Things like, "Mom, this house is too big for one person," or "You really should be somewhere with people your own age." At first, I laughed it off. I told Renee I had plenty of people my own age, my neighbor Winifred next door, my water aerobics ladies, my friend Gloria from the food pantry who'd been making me laugh since 1987. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't struggling. I was fine. The comments didn't stop. By the third year of their marriage, it wasn't subtle anymore. Clive started asking me questions about the house, how much I thought it was worth, whether I'd had an appraisal recently, whether I'd thought about downsizing while the market was good. He asked these things at Thanksgiving dinner, between the mashed potatoes and the pie, like it was perfectly normal conversation. I looked at my daughter. She looked at her plate. I drove home that night feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not anger yet, something quieter. A kind of watchfulness. That winter, Renee called me with a new idea. She said she and Clive had been doing a lot of thinking. She said they were worried about me. She said, and I remember this exactly because I wrote it down in my journal that same night, "Mom, what if something happened to you and no one was there? You're all alone in that house. It's not safe." I reminded her that I was in excellent health, that my doctor had told me at my last checkup that my blood pressure was better than most people 20 years younger than me, that I walked 2 miles every morning and could carry my own groceries just fine. "Thank you," she said. "I know, Mom. I know you're doing great. But we'd just feel better knowing you were somewhere with support. There's this wonderful place. We've already looked at it. It's more like a community than a nursing home. They have activities and—" I said, "Renee, I'm not moving." There was a pause. Then she said, "Just come look at it. That's all we're asking." I went. I don't know why I went. Maybe because some part of me still believed my daughter had my best interests at heart. Maybe because I thought if I just went and saw the place and told her it wasn't for me, she'd drop it. Maybe I was just too tired to fight that day. The place was called Sycamore Ridge. It was clean. The staff was pleasant. There were watercolor painting classes and a little library with paperbacks. It wasn't terrible. It also wasn't my home, my garden, my 31 years of life. On the drive back, Renee was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What did you think?" I said it was nice, but I wasn't interested. She nodded. She didn't push. I thought maybe that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, Renee and Clive came to the house together on a Saturday morning. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table I'd sat at with Renee 1,000 times before, and Clive put a folder on the table and pushed it toward me. Inside were papers, a lot of papers. He started explaining. Something about a trust arrangement, something about transferring the property for tax purposes, something about protecting my assets. He used a lot of words very quickly. I am not a stupid woman, but I am also not a lawyer, and the language in those documents was dense and technical, and I could feel my head swimming a little. I said I wanted to take some time to read through everything. Clive said, "Of course, we just need to get it signed before the end of the month, though, for the tax year." I said, "What's the rush?" He smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "No rush," he said. "We just want to make sure you're protected." I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her coffee cup. I said, "Let me think about it." They left. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after the door closed behind them. Then I picked up the folder and read every word as carefully as I could. What I understood was this: the documents would transfer ownership of my home into a trust. What I didn't understand was who would control that trust. I called my neighbor Winifred. She came over with her reading glasses and her sharp mind. She'd been a paralegal for 20 years before she retired, and she sat with me at that same kitchen table and read through every page. When she finished, she took off her glasses and set them on the table very deliberately. She said, "A deal. This gives Renee and Clive control of the trust." I said, "Meaning what?" She said, "Meaning they could make decisions about the property, including selling it." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "They could sell my house." Winifred said, "With you still living in it, technically, or after moving you out. The documents don't have strong protections for you as a resident." I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I didn't. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed in the dark, and I thought about the Thanksgiving dinner with Clive's questions. I thought about Renee looking at her plate. I thought about the folder appearing at my table on a Saturday morning with a deadline at the end of the month. I thought about 31 years of mortgage payments, of refinancing to pay for Renee's college tuition, of the garden I'd planted and replanted every spring. And I made a decision. The next morning, I called an attorney. His name was Mr. Felton, and he'd been recommended to me years ago by a woman at my church whose family had gone through a complicated estate situation. I'd never needed him before. I was glad I had his number. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Mrs. Adele, I'm glad you called before you signed anything." He walked me through what the documents actually meant. Winifred had been right. More than that, Mr. Felton explained that what Renee and Clive were attempting could potentially constitute financial elder abuse under state law, depending on how things proceeded. That word, abuse. I had to stop him and ask him to repeat it. He repeated it, calmly, matter-of-factly, like it was simply a legal category. To him, I suppose it was. To me, it was my daughter. I asked Mr. Felton what my options were. He laid them out. I could refuse to sign and simply say no. I could sign a different set of documents he would prepare, a proper revocable living trust that named me as sole trustee for as long as I was living, with ironclad protections. Or I could do both, refuse their documents, then secure my own. I chose to do something else first. I called Renee and told her I'd been reading through the papers and I had some questions. She said she'd come by Thursday evening. I said that would be fine. Thursday evening, she came alone. "Clive had a work thing," she said. We sat at the kitchen table. I made tea. I asked her, very directly, what would happen to my house if I signed those papers. She said, "Mom, it's just about protecting your assets." I said, "If something happened to me, what would happen to the house?" She said, "It would be managed by the trust." I said, "Managed by who?" A pause. "By me and Clive." "But Mom, that's so we can. Could you sell it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "In certain circumstances," she said carefully. "If it was in your best interest, if you needed the funds for your care." There it was. I looked at my daughter whose hair I used to braid, whose nightmares I used to sit with, whose wedding I cried through, and I saw something I didn't recognize, or maybe something I'd been refusing to see. I said, "I'm not signing those papers, Renee." She said, "Mom." I said, "I'm not, and I want you to know that I've spoken with an attorney." The look on her face changed. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder. She said, "You hired a lawyer? Against us?" I said, "I hired a lawyer to protect myself. That's not against anyone." She left shortly after that. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't say anything terrible. She just became very still and very polite in the way people do when they're regrouping. 3 days later, I received an email from Clive. It was long and carefully worded. It said they were very concerned about my cognitive health. It said my neighbor Winifred was a negative influence. It said that they were looking into their legal options for ensuring I was properly cared for. Cognitive health. Those were the words he used. I was doing the New York Times crossword in pen. I was managing my own finances, my own medications, my own calendar. I was in better shape, physically and mentally, than I'd been at 50, but I understood what those words meant as a legal strategy. I'd watched enough true crime documentaries to know where that road led. I called Mr. Felton immediately. He was not surprised. He said this kind of escalation was common. He had already prepared the documents for my own trust, and he advised me to sign them right away. He also advised me to begin keeping records. Every email, every visit, every conversation I could document. I signed my trust documents that week. My home went into a revocable living trust with me as sole trustee and a trusted friend of mine, a woman named Gloria from the food pantry, named as successor trustee. Not Renee, not Clive. Then I waited. Renee called twice that week. I didn't answer. I was done having conversations that weren't going anywhere good. The following Saturday, they both showed up at my door. Unannounced. Clive had a manila envelope. I opened the door. I did not invite them in. Clive said they needed to talk. He said they were going to help me find a place at Sycamore Ridge, that it was time, that they had already spoken with someone there about availability. He said the house would be better used. He used that phrase, better used, if it were sold and the proceeds used to fund my care. I said, I'm not going to Sycamore Ridge. He said, we're not asking, Adele. There it was again, the thing I'd been watching for. I said, my attorney has been in contact with Adult Protective Services. They're aware of the situation. The air changed. I said, I've also been in contact with my state representative's office. There are laws in this state regarding financial exploitation of elders. I'd recommend you speak with your own attorney before we continue this conversation. Clive opened his mouth, closed it. Renee was staring at me like she didn't know who I was. Maybe she didn't. Maybe the version of me she'd been counting on, the one who would apologize to keep the peace, who would sign things to avoid conflict, who would go quietly. Maybe that woman never really existed, or maybe she had, once, and life had quietly replaced her with someone who'd seen too much to be moved by pressure. I said, goodbye, Renee. Goodbye, Clive. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee and took it out to the back porch and sat looking at my garden. What followed was not quick or easy. I won't pretend it was. There were phone calls from a family attorney Clive had hired. There was a period of about 6 weeks where I wasn't sure what was going to happen, where I slept a little less easily, where I double-checked the locks and kept my phone charged and close. Mr. Felton filed paperwork. I filed a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services. Gloria drove me to every appointment and sat in the waiting room and made me laugh on the hard days, and Adult Protective Services investigated. They interviewed me. They interviewed Renee and Clive separately. They reviewed the original trust documents Clive had prepared. Mr. Felton provided documentation of the timeline, the emails, the visits. In the end, there was no trial. Clive and Renee's attorney reached out about a settlement. There were conditions. They were to have no further contact with me unless I initiated it. Clive was required to complete a financial counseling program. The matter was documented and would remain on record. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom scene I'd maybe half expected. Real life rarely is. But it was over, and I was still in my house, and the papers that mattered, the ones that actually protected me, were signed and filed and legal. The day the settlement was finalized, I went out to my garden and pulled weeds for an hour. It sounds small, but that garden is mine. I put every plant in that soil. I decide what grows there. I haven't heard from Renee since. I won't say that doesn't hurt. It does. There are mornings when I pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit, the way I used to when she'd stop by on weekends, and I stand there holding both of them for a second before I pour one back. She is still my daughter. That doesn't stop being true just because she let me down. But I am also still myself. Adele, 68 years old, with a vegetable garden and a Tuesday water aerobics class, and a friend named Gloria, who drives me to appointments and makes me laugh on the hard days. A woman who read the documents before she signed them. A woman who made the call. Last month, a woman at my food pantry shift. She must have been in her mid-70s, hair silver and neat, very dignified, pulled me aside before we started and told me her son had been asking questions about her house. Just questions, she said. Nothing serious yet, but something about it didn't feel right. I asked her if she had a lawyer. She said she'd never needed one. I said, "You might need one now, just to talk to, just to know where you stand." She wrote down Mr. Felton's name on a little notepad she keeps in her apron pocket. I went home that evening and sat on my back porch as the sun went down, and I felt something I can only describe as useful. Like the hardest thing I'd ever been through had been building toward something. Not just my own protection, something bigger than that. You work your whole life. You raise your children. You keep the porch light on, and then one day you realize the light has to stay on for you too, not just for them. I kept mine on, and I'm still here.